Hi, as Matt mentioned, I'm Amir. Thank you for having me back. Is that better? All right, everyone hear me? Perfect. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think are problems with centralized internet access today. And I know decentralization is a very buzzwordy, kind of lame thing, so I'll try and get into some real important, try and get into things of value today. So you guys are all young and vibrant looking, so maybe you don't remember the dial-up days, but back in the old days, in the mid-90s, dial-up was the way that... So in the early days of the consumer internet, which is kind of in the mid-90s, and I know the internet existed before this, but this was really the start of what I would call the consumer internet. And it never really occurred to me, but my one bragging moment in this talk will be that I'm a former world champion esports gamer back in those days in a different life. And it never really occurred to me how important this part of life was. But in the dial-up days, arguably you had the most competitive time for internet access, right? You had a real physical separation between the people that brought the internet cable to your house and the people that provided the hardware and the people that were the ISPs. Right, and so if, again, you guys are too young perhaps for this because you all look young, but you had companies like US Robotics that made modems, and you had ISPs like Speakeasy, and then you had the telephone company like Verizon. And so you had a very clear distinction around who did what, and you got a lot of choice between what you picked there, right? If you wanted a low latency 56K ISP, it was probably more expensive, but if that's what you wanted because you were playing Quake 14 hours a day, that's what you did, right? And it was different than today. And so I hadn't really thought about this until I wrote this presentation, but this was the most competitive time when it came to consumer internet access. Once the internet sort of got more adopted and page loads got bigger and everything got more complicated, it wasn't really an option to use dial-up anymore, right? And so cable appeared. And I would argue that this was the point that everything got sort of terrible in internet land. Because the provider of the cable to your house was also the ISP, right? And if you guys aren't familiar with the difference in the ISP and the cable, the ISP is the actual internet service provider that is responsible for you connecting to the internet versus the physical line that actually carries the data. And in the US, there's not a whole lot you can do about the fact that you only have a single provider, right? So where I live in San Francisco, we have one provider, right? It's Comcast. And if you don't really like Comcast, you're kind of screwed, right? You don't have a lot of choice there. And this is called, if you guys aren't familiar with this term, this is called the local loop, right? The physical cable that actually delivers the internet to your house from the local exchange is called the local loop. And it's a weird situation because the company that dug the cable in the first place probably did it under some extremely favorable regulatory conditions, right? They probably got a bunch of tax breaks, there's probably a bunch of incentives from municipalities and cities. And so they did it in sort of unfair terms, right? So Comcast or whoever it was got to dig these cables and sort of cheat a little bit. And so in the mid-90s, they started to introduce these laws that were called LLUs. These were like local loop unbundlings, right? This was the idea that if Comcast dug the cable, they should be forced to sell it to other people that could provide competitive ISP access to you. Of course, there's no real incentive for Comcast to do this, right? They're moving as slow as humanly possible. These laws were introduced, the local loop unbundlings were introduced in like the late 90s, and nothing has happened still, right? Like Comcast is still the only way I can get access to the internet. And so we're now like 20 years in, and I don't see the situation changing because there's not a whole lot of incentive for the incumbents to do anything about it. There's also not a whole lot of incentive for the cities to let other people dig. And the most recent example of this is Google Fiber. Right? If you remember, like Google Fiber felt like it was spreading like wildfire for a moment, and everyone was like hoping that they would have a gigabit access in their city next. And all of a sudden it stopped. And the reason it stopped is that it became extremely challenging for Google to dig. And it wasn't because they didn't have the money, they obviously have the money. It was that they couldn't get cities to let them dig. And so what they started to do was start thinking about how can I deliver residential broadband wirelessly, right? And so the local loop is a big problem, and it's kind of a unique US problem actually. Like in other countries this is a little bit different. But part of what you get with all of this is that you get this sort of, and this is a very dramatic slide, right? It's not really an invasion, but it feels like an invasion, right? You have one cable company providing you your cable and your ISP, and also in most cases the hardware. Even in situations where you can replace the hardware, like you guys are a savvy tech audience, and perhaps you have used different hardware than what the cable company gives you. But for the most part, you're going to use what the cable company gives you. And there are statistics out there that show that something like 75 or 80% of cable customers just use what the cable company gives them. And for the most part, that's fine, right? You get a free cable modem, or you sort of release it, or whatever the deal is. You get a Wi-Fi access point out of it. It's all very convenient. But what you don't realize a lot of the time is that they're doing some insidious things with the hardware that's in your home. Comcast, for example, is also running a LoRa network in your house. You may not know that. It may exist, it may not exist. You don't really know. They're also, in Comcast, in my area, also sells access to my Wi-Fi hotspot. They have a thing called the Xfinity hotspot. The idea is that everyone, everywhere, shares their hotspots, and in general, it's going to average out. I don't really want to do that, right? Like, it's a difficult thing to actually turn off. They use the sort of traditional dark pattern, like terrible UI tactics that make it almost impossible for you to turn these things off. And most of the time, it's predicated on the fact that you don't really know it exists. So I think this like combination of hardware, ISP, and cable is actually a real problem. And in cellular, Apple did something which was very different from everything else in the cellular industry. They sort of said to AT&T, who were the first carriers for the iPhone, we're not interested in letting you guys control the firmware, the software, or anything about the device. And you guys know this, but it was a substantially different approach than anyone had taken to internet access since dial-up. And what it meant was that the cellular carriers became sort of commoditized entities, right? Anyone, anywhere could be a cellular carrier, and it didn't really matter. No one cared. It was just whoever was cheapest, who had the best coverage. There was no built-in thing. You weren't forced to buy a particular phone. There were no exclusives. Well, there was for a little while, but just forget that. But as the cost of like deploying network access increases, which is what's going to happen with 5G, and I'll talk about that in a second, I think there's a real risk of cellular carrier consolidation. Right, I think what we're going to see is, and we saw this already with T-Mobile and Sprint, they're trying to merge, right? Because the cost of deploying cellular coverage, especially in a 5G universe, I'll again get to 5G in a second, is really, really expensive. Right? They've reached the sort of threshold of what can be done with 4G and LTE, and the next wave is 5G, which involves a lot of small boxes in lots and lots of neighborhoods. And we're talking hundreds of boxes per neighborhood, similar to what Starry is doing, right? Starry is another FirstMark company that's trying to deliver residential broadband through 60 gigahertz wireless. And the only way you can do that is sort of with line of sight to every single subscriber. And so this is really, really, really expensive. And so I think we're going to see some strange activity in the cellular market because it's going to be too expensive for anyone to compete here. And so net neutrality is a thing that everyone has heard of. And I won't bore you guys with too much of the detail, but I didn't know a lot about how net neutrality came to be until I started writing this. But the bottom line is, in 2015, the FCC reclassified internet access as common carriers. Right? They said Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, guys like you are common carriers. And that sounds like a pretty innocent thing to do, right? Like that sounds like maybe that's even sensible. But that actually was a huge problem because it meant that the Federal Trade Commission, who usually governs governs wireless or internet access, no longer had any mandate to cover common carriers. It's not part of what they do, apparently. They're no longer able to go prosecute common carriers. And so in the old days, pre-2015, the FTC would go after ISPs, right? If they shared your data and you didn't allow it, you had to opt in to share things like your social security number, your financial data. And if you didn't do that, the FTC would come punish them. And so there was a real there was a real impediment to them actually doing this. After they switched to this sort of common carrier thing in 2015, the only real rule that the FCC had was this thing called net neutrality. And so they invented this idea that we should create this set of rules that all ISPs should follow. As we know, net neutrality is now dead, and there's actually no way to apparently revert from a common carrier to whatever it was before that, so we're sort of stuck with the status quo. And it means that there's not really a whole lot of rules governing what ISPs do anymore. And it's very much interpreted by the ISP. Maybe once in a while you'll get one of those $2 class action checks, but there's very little that ISPs are beholden to at this point. And so you get this kind of thing, right, where ISPs are taking full advantage of the situation. My graphic designer took some liberties on this, which is kind of cool. But in 2013, the worst example was AT&T. Right? In 2013, they said, you have to pay us an extra $29 a month, or we're going to deliver all your personal information to ad agencies. Like, that was the deal, right? You either give us the 29 bucks, or we're handing it all over, and we're going to start selling ads against you. And so this is the most insidious example I've seen. And it's gotten even worse now because a lot of the ISPs actually own ad agencies, right? So the ads that are actually being delivered to you are not really being shared with a third party, so they're sort of like skating around the rules because they are the ad agency, right? So they're not sharing any data outside. And there's things you can do, like you can use HTTPS, right, which gives you some anonymity. But it only really hides the pages that you look at. It doesn't hide the domains that you go to. The ISP still knows that you went to Google. They just don't know that you went to Google and searched for helium or whatever it may be. And Tor is great, but there's a lot of latency. There aren't that many nodes. Apparently the government controls most of the exit nodes. And so there are challenges around how you solve this problem. And arguably in the US, we have it actually pretty good. Despite everything I just said, like the situation in the US is actually not bad, right? Like the worst case is that you get some ads and it's kind of annoying and people are sharing your data. But in the rest of the world, it's actually much worse than this. And simple examples are like my family lives in Dubai. When I travel to Dubai, you can't use FaceTime. You can't use iMessage. You can't use Skype. Those things are just shut down. So that's kind of inconvenient. And you probably saw that in China, Google has like a special Chinese version of Google. But I think it's a lot worse than that when you look at something like Saudi Arabia, who wants to execute gay people who show their sexuality online. Right, so rather than just being sort of inconvenient and annoying, it sort of becomes a little bit dangerous when you've got governments that want to act this way. So we're sort of protected in the US because we have strong free speech and we have strong privacy laws, but in the rest of the world this isn't true. And so I think this is the better way to do things, right? In the early days of the internet, again, you guys are way too young for this, by the look of you all, there was a set of open protocols. There were things like BGP and DNS and things that like formed the core basis of the internet. And the reason that a lot of these things don't have things like identity and security built into them is because they were run by the people that actually use the internet, right? It was sort of this trusted group of people that was relatively small in size. And so it wasn't really designed for a lot of the problems that we have today. But I think using and whatever you, like regardless what you think of blockchains and cryptocurrencies and everything else, the thing that they've really advanced is how you think about public key cryptography and how you think about zero-knowledge proofs. And like some of the stuff that's being invented in the modern like blockchain era is like incredible. And they've sort of pushed the boundaries around what decentralization looks like, what distributed systems looks like, and what cryptography looks like. There are still like real problems to solve, like how you actually get past things like trunk providers, which are the guys that really connect the internet together. So people like Level 3 and Comcast and guys like that. There isn't a great solution to that question. But in general, I think if you can operate in a decentralized way where privacy and freedom from censorship are sort of built-in primitives, that's a significantly better approach than the one we have today. Yeah. And so there are some cool companies doing things in this space, right? So you've got people like Orchid, Brave, Filecoin, and of course Helium, that we think are doing like very, very important work around decentralizing key parts of the internet. Again, everyone hates blockchains, I think, at this point, or it's become an overused buzzword. But what it really helps us do is create permissionless systems that anyone can join as long as they follow by the same rules. And there's a ledger built into there as to what your reputation is, and you get rewarded for that, right? There's a scoring system built into them, which is kind of cool. So Orchid, for example, is a cool example of this. They're sort of building a Tor-like system, and they're rewarding the people for actually serving as Tor nodes in their system. It's not Tor, it's their own protocol, but it's the same kind of idea. And so there's sort of a built-in incentive there for like why you would actually operate a Tor node, which is something you don't have today, which I think is why Tor is a little bit lacking. Filecoin will help you store files anonymously, and it will be distributed and encrypted such that no one really knows what you're storing and can't ever be censored. Things like Brave have sort of pushed the boundary of like what browsers should be doing. They force HTTPS, they block all ads, and they have Tor as a tab option, right? So you can open a tab that runs in Tor, which is awesome. And then at Helium, we're sort of taking a slightly different approach and thinking like, how do we decentralize the physical part of the internet? How do we decentralize the wireless link back to base? Which is arguably the hardest problem to solve because it involves hardware, and it involves peering agreements, and it involves trunks. But as we see 5G start to get adopted, where lots and lots of these boxes need to be deployed, you start to imagine a universe where the real reason that Verizon and AT&T and these guys like this exist is because they have access to real estate. But the thing is, you guys also have access to real estate. And so if you can create a system where everyone here is incentivized to run their own effectively cellular network, I think this is a slightly better approach than what we have with AT&T and Verizon. The other cool thing about 5G, which sort of makes this actually possible, is it all runs in unlicensed spectrum. So you guys have probably seen in recent times like Verizon and Google and guys like this fighting over like multi-billion-dollar spectrum auctions. You actually don't need that anymore in this setting, right? Everything runs in 60 gigahertz, which is unlicensed spectrum. And so any of us here can actually run a cellular network if we feel like it, which is a huge shift from what we've seen in 4G and LTE and before it. So what I hope we'll see, and just to wrap up because I'm way over time already, what I hope we'll see is a network that is more owned and operated by the people that use it, which is a little bit more like the old original internet. And what Helium is trying to do is build a blueprint effectively and design the technology around how that should occur. And ideally you end up with sort of this mesh of open technologies that are sort of owned and operated by the people using the internet. Censorship, resilience, privacy are sort of built-in primitives to how that works. So that's kind of all I wanted to tell you. It's very little about what Helium does, but I'm happy to answer any questions. But this is, to me, a very important topic, and I'll leave it there because I'm at least 3 minutes over time.
All right, so we're a little over time, so I'll just one question for me, but I guess, you know, a softball to you. So how does Helium solve this problem?
You're not an investor in the company, are you? So what we're doing is we're starting with the Internet of Things, which is a term I was just talking to Hytham. I hate the term, the Internet of Things, the worst term. But we're starting with how do we solve the idea of building large-scale networks for IoT devices? So this class of sensors and low-power things that doesn't really exist today, right? There are no low-power tracking devices. There are no low-power sensors. They should be prolific. They should be everywhere. It hasn't really happened. Like none of the existing technologies are well-suited for that. So what we've decided to do is try and incentivize people to help us build this network by building our own blockchain and incentivizing people to actually install these what we call them gateways. But essentially, you stick a device in your house, it creates network access for other people, you get rewarded in a cryptocurrency for doing that, you also get paid in a cryptocurrency for people that need to access your network. So if you can imagine a tile kind of device coming near your house, they would pay you in order to access the internet and send data back to base. And that's our sort of thesis for like how all of these wireless networks should be built. IoT is sort of the easiest place for us to start because we think it's the least well served. There are physical reasons why it can be done better, like range is better on the wireless side. But fundamentally, we think this is an approach that can work for lots of different types of networks.
All right, do we have questions? Yep, one in the back.
I like this yellow thing, the minion.
Yes.
Is decentralization potentially disintermediating the data center industry, and that the use for, the need for servers in the cloud is going to be?
I think in the end, yes. I mean, it would be nice to imagine if that whole business could go away, but I don't think so. I think really the biggest problem lies in the physical part of the connection, right? Sort of the thing that I described. Like, I don't know what it's like in New York, but we have very, very few options where I live. Like, you have literally one option. Like, there is no other option. You can only use Comcast, right? That's the only way you can get online, unless you want to go back to the dial-up days of the 90s. And so I think that's the biggest impediment, right? And when you think about net neutrality and everything that sort of comes with it, it's really about the fact that there's a single provider that owns that connection to you and what they may or may not be able to do with that, right? And we've seen examples where people have thought about charging differently for one service to another. That's sort of the easiest and lamest example where Netflix might do a deal with Comcast and so the traffic would be free, but when you went to YouTube, it was more expensive, or the AT&T thing where they charge you for not sharing your data and things like that. That's, to me, the hardest problem to solve because it involves like real physical things, right? No one wants to deal with physical things. Everyone wants to do the software eats the world thing, which is great. I want to do the software eats the world thing too, but you have to like solve that part first, I think, to really get to the core of the problem, which is like how do you do the last mile, and how do you decentralize that part of the equation? It's extremely complicated, extremely difficult.
And maybe like I don't know how much you can or you want to talk about current status, but all of this is very real. The gateways exist, they'll be shipped. There's a bunch of people that are ready to put them online across major cities and around the world.
Yeah, so we have what we call a friends and family network that will go live in October, and that's about 200 locations that are across the Bay Area, New York, Boston, LA. And the range of each gateway is extremely large. Like one of the things I mentioned just sort of in passing was that IoT is easier in some ways. One of the reasons that it's easier is that the data rate is very low, and so the range of the wireless can be very high. So we've got like a 12-mile range, for example, from the roof of our office all the way across the Golden Gate Bridge into Marin. And so you can build large area networks when the kinds of data rates that you're dealing with are very, very low. It gets harder when you start dealing with things like cellular and Wi-Fi when data rates need to be high. The range of the wireless will inevitably be lower. But yeah, so we've got 200 of these gateways going live in October. We have a pre-interest sign-up form where we have something like 1 million gateways that people have said they want to purchase and distribute around the world. There's one guy in Vietnam that wants to run 2,000 gateways, for example, and set up his own networks. And so I think developing world applications are like absolutely fascinating because there's really no infrastructure there for anything like this. So yeah, so we hope to start shipping these things in Q1 in a real-life way. Hopefully we don't end up like Farhad and 16 months late, but you'll be yelling at us long before that.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Sorry, thanks.
Great. Oh, okay. One last question.
Yep. You come back to the basic problem of dealing with the giants, right? So let's say you build so many gateways, and those gateways are something that will be a bridge between the decentralized private networks to the main frequency, which is the licensed frequency band that these big players operate. Let's say I'm a techie and I get your device and set up my own cell phone network, but my friends are all living in Verizon or Sprint. And, these gateways still have to be on Sprint's or Verizon or AT&T networks, and they could throttle it anyway. Because why not? Because the reason why Bitcoin haven't catch up so fast is that Visa or MasterCard, they don't let those payment gateways into those payments, and this is a problem that we can't solve because the nature of decentralization is that you'll need your own gateway, or you'll have to be independent of the major players like Comcast or Verizon to be out of their network.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, there are steps that have to be taken, unfortunately, and step one still involves you having to backhaul data over the bad guys, right? Like you still have to use Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, guys like that to get data from the gateway back to the internet to start. And we think there are things that, you know, some of as I mentioned, some of the innovations around public key cryptography are just like incredible. Like, I think most of the blockchain space is a sham, but some of it is incredible, you know, and some of the work that's actually being done there is like moving the bar for like what public key cryptography looks like. And so that allows us to at least be a little bit more anonymous in terms of what the data is that we send over those ways. So in step one, that's right. Eventually, what I anticipate is that you will get guys like the guy in Vietnam that wants to buy 2,000 gateways, who wants to start sticking these into points of presence, right? And points of presence are the place where your connection goes back to the main internet and it backhauls over level 3 and the big guys. And eventually that's how you could imagine it working, is that some entrepreneurs will start to place gateways in points of presence and they will start to be the backhaul providers, right? And you won't need Verizon, you won't need Comcast, and someone will start doing those deals with level 3 and everyone else, and you eventually need to replace the trunks and the peers somehow. I just don't know how you do that yet. I don't have a good solution to that, to all of the problems, but I have solutions up until about step 5, and then it all sort of breaks a little bit. So I think you just got to take it in steps, and the start is like, can we service the IoT industry in a way that it hasn't been serviced? Because it's still, to me, a sort of shambles, right? We've been in this, how long is this, 5 years now? And there's still a real lack of IoT standards, lack of IoT adoption, lack of devices. I don't think there are any wireless battery-powered devices in this room, or probably in the several square mile radius of this building. And that, to me, is a real problem. I mean, the easiest example for me to look at is up where I live in Northern California. We have fires all around us pretty much all the time right now. And no one can actually tell me what the air quality looks like, even within a 20-mile radius of my house. And it feels like that kind of stuff should just be an easily solved problem. Like we have the technology to solve this, and someone just needs to put all the pieces together and do it in a way that is open source, using standards-based things, that isn't proprietary, and inclusive, and I think we will start to like see some of that adoption. We have no shortage of use cases if that kind of technology existed.
All right, on this note, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.